going to go over the naming and classifying of microorganisms. Taxonomy is just the science of classifying and naming organisms. Tax just means order and nom means name. So taxonomy literally just means the order of naming. And then systematics or phylogeny, that just shows the evolutionary history of organisms. So this is just when you're making the evolutionary trees to show the relationships between different species. So the reason that we came up with using scientific names and we no longer use common names in science is because common names are very confusing. So for example, if we take a look at this species over here in the top right, we've got a couple of different common names that you can think of for this animal here. So I'm sure that you may have come up with names like mountain lion or cougar, and depending on the area of the country you're in, some people might also call this a panther, and other areas of the country might also call it a catamount, which is kind of a strange name. So if you grew up learning this as a mountain lion and somebody else grew up learning it as a cougar and you're talking to each other and you don't realize that a cougar and a mountain lion are the exact same things, it gets pretty confusing. So that's what was going on when a Swedish scientist, Carolus Linnaeus, came along, and he was getting very frustrated with these common names, and he decided, well, let's just go ahead and use these scientific names. And so he's the one that came up with this genus and species, this binomial nomenclature. So let's just give you a couple examples of some genus and species names for the microorganisms. And the genus and species names, the genus name is always going to be capitalized. So for example, Staphylococcus aureus. And then the species name is not capitalized. And if we take a look at the genus and species name, usually there's something there that gives us a description of the organism. So if we look at Staphylococcus, coccus means round. So if you look at these bacteria under the microscope, they look like little round balls. And then Staphylo means grape-like cluster. And Staphylococcus aureus, when it divides, the cells end up kind of sticking together and they make these grape-like clusters. So you'll see that under the microscope when you look at these. And then the species name aureus, if you remember from chemistry what the chemical symbol for gold is. If you remembered AU, so aureus means gold. So it just describes the color of Staphylococcus aureus when you grow it in the petri dish in the lab. The colonies are a golden color. So that's where it got the name. All right, and then another example, let's do Escherichia coli. So how this bacterium got its name, scientists love to name organisms after themselves, and that's what happened here. So the scientist that discovered this bacterium, his last name was Escherichia, and so that's where that part of the name came from. He named it after himself. And then coli, the species name, is just describing where Escherichia coli likes to live inside of us. So that's where the scientific name for E. coli came from. Great, and then we have our taxonomic hierarchy. So I know that you've learned this before, and I just want you to memorize the order. So remember that domain is the broadest category, and then we get smaller as we go down. So then we have kingdom, and then phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then finally we have just one organism left when we get to species. So a good way to remember the order of this is just remembering the first letter of each of these words. So I just remember, did King Philip come over for good soup? So did King Philip come over for good soup? And that'll help you remember the correct order for the taxonomic hierarchy. And there is more of an R-rated version of this, and I'm sure you could probably think about that. So whatever helps you remember this, that would be good. So this would be a great test question. I would star that in your notes. I would definitely be able to pick that out on the test, knowing the correct order of the taxonomic hierarchy. Okay, the other thing I would know is the definition for a eukaryotic species, which I know that you've learned before. So remember that a eukaryotic species is just a group of organisms that sexually reproduce with each other to produce fertile offspring. And kind of keep that definition in mind, because when we get to defining what a prokaryotic species is later on, in chapter 4, it's going to be very different, okay? Great, and then here's just a couple of examples using this taxonomic hierarchy for our 3 different domains. We've got domain Eukarya here, and here we've got an example of a fungi. We've got yeast, and you can just look at the classification for yeast. And this one happens to be for baker's yeast that you would be using to make bread. And then here we've got domain Archaea. And this one is for a methanococcus, which actually makes methane gas. And this species actually happens to live in deep sea vents. And then we've got domain bacteria, and we've got E. coli here. So you can just kind of look through those. And then also notice that Eukarya does have the kingdom classification, but there are no kingdoms in domains Archaea or bacteria. They just never made any for those. So, okay, so our next thing that we want to make sure that start in your notes is make sure you know the 3 domains. So remember, this is our broadest taxonomic group, and the 3 domains, remember, we've got bacteria and Archaea, and then domain Eukarya. Okay, so those are the 3 domains that if we find a new organism, we will classify them into one of those 3 domains. Now, how we figure out which domain this new organism belongs into depends. Obviously, if they have a nucleus, we know that they're going to be in domain Eukarya, right? Because those are all the eukaryotes there. But domains bacteria and Archaea, these are all prokaryotes. Okay, so they do not have a nucleus, and just looking at them, they look pretty much alike. So how would you tell which one's a bacteria and which one's an Archaean? So how we decide which domain something belongs into is we're going to compare the DNA. And so we want to look at a gene that is found in all 3 domains, that every organism is going to have this particular gene. So we thought about it, and we thought, well, what's something that every cell has? So one thing that all cells have is every cell has ribosomes, right? And so they're all going to have rRNA genes. So they all need to make ribosomal RNA, which, remember, that is making up part of the ribosomes. So that is what we're going to compare. We're going to look at the sequence of the ribosomal RNA genes, because everybody has rRNA genes. And then depending on the sequence, that'll let us know, oh, this is a bacterial cell, or oh, that belongs in the domain Archaea, or oh, that's a eukaryote. Okay, so that would be important to know as well. So let's take a look at this phylogenetic tree of the 3 domains, and we need to decide which of the 3 domains evolved first. So how we decide that is we're going to take a look at the roots or the base of the phylogenetic tree, and this represents the last universal common ancestor. So whatever cell gave rise to all of the domains that are, alive today. So whatever that cell was, that's the base or the root of our tree. And then from that root of the tree, we're just going to move up our tree, and whatever our first branch is off that root, that's the first domain that evolved. And so you can see the bacteria, they were the first domain to evolve, so they're the oldest. So the bacteria were the first domain to appear on Earth. Okay, so bacteria are the first to evolve. So so domain bacteria was the first to evolve. And then the second domain to evolve, if we keep moving up our phylogenetic tree, our next one to branch off would be domain Archaea. So Archaea were the second to evolve. And then the last one to evolve would be domain Eukarya. So eukaryotes are the youngest domain, they're the newest one. Okay, so we haven't been around as long as the bacteria and Archaea have. Okay, and what's interesting, which we'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later, that the Archaea are kind of a mix between the bacteria and the eukaryotes. So they have characteristics of the bacteria, but they also do share some similarities with the eukaryotes as well. And we can see why that is because they evolved second, so they share some similarities with the bacteria, and then the eukaryotes evolved last. And so, because they evolved after the Archaea did, you can see why the eukaryotes have some similarities with the Archaea as well. So. Now we're going to take a little bit closer look at each of the domains. We're going to start with domain bacteria. And as domain bacteria, are they going to be prokaryotes or eukaryotes? Hopefully you answered that they are prokaryotes. So that means they do not have a nucleus and they do not have any organelles. And bacteria are also usually going to all be unicellular. And they have most of them are going to have a cell wall made out of something called peptidoglycan. And peptidoglycan is really important. We're going to be talking a lot about that in chapter 3. And if we look at the word peptidoglycan, thinking about what 2 types of organic molecules peptidoglycan is made out of, if we break down the word peptidoglycan, peptido, what do you suppose the organic molecule being referred to is there? So peptido is referring to proteins. And then what about glycan? So glycan is referring to carbohydrates. So their cell wall made out of peptidoglycan. The peptidoglycan is just made out of proteins and carbohydrates. So we'll look at that in chapter 3. All right, some of the bacteria have flagella, and they use those to swim around, but not all bacteria have flagella, so some are not able to swim. How they divide is something called binary fission. They do not divide by mitosis. Only eukaryotic cells do that. Okay, so don't tell me they divide by mitosis. So binary fission is very different. We'll talk about what that is. But basically they split in two, because binary means two and fission means to split. How they get their energy depends on the bacteria. Some will get their energy from breaking down organic molecules. Some of them use inorganic molecules. Maybe they're using something like sulfur, or maybe they're using ammonia or iron or all kinds of different things. And then others are photosynthetic. Yes, we actually do have photosynthetic bacteria. And you can actually see that in this picture here. We've got some cyanobacteria. Cyano means blue-green, talking about their color. And the reason that they're that color is because they have chlorophyll in them. Remember, chlorophyll is the photosynthetic pigment that's used to capture the sunlight. Do not tell me that the cyanobacteria have chloroplasts, because they do not. Because remember, they're prokaryotes. They do not have any organelles like chloroplasts. Okay? But because the cyanobacteria have the chlorophyll, not chloroplasts, they're able to capture that light energy, and they're able to do photosynthesis, and in that process, they produce oxygen, which we can certainly use. Next we have domain Archaea, and are these prokaryotes or eukaryotes? Hopefully you remember that these are prokaryotes as well, like the bacteria. So again, no nucleus and no organelles. They look very similar to the bacteria. They're similar in size. If you look under a microscope, they look very similar, but they are not similar as far as their DNA. So that's why we put them into a separate domain. They do have a cell wall, most of them, but it's not made out of peptidoglycan. It's just made out of some different proteins and carbohydrates. And the other thing that's unique about the Archaea, a lot of them are what we call extremophiles. And remember that word phil means to love, and so they love living in extreme environments. So some of them are what we call methanogens. Gen means to create or produce, and so what do you suppose they're creating or producing? So hopefully you said methane gas. So these methanogens like to live in environments without oxygen. And so we actually have methanogens. We actually have these Archaea that produce methane gas living in our GI tract. And yes, they produce methane gas in there that comes out. So we can thank them for that. We also have halophiles. Think about where they might love living. What does halo mean? So halo means salt. So these like to live in very salty environments. So there are Archaea that are extreme halophiles that like to live, for example, in the Great Salt Lake. So if you've seen pictures of the Great Salt Lake, the northern part that's all pink, those are Archaea that are living in the really salty environment in the water up there. And they're pink because they have a photosynthetic pigment that's kind of a reddish color that colors the water pink. And then we have extreme thermophiles. So where do you suppose they love living? What is thermo referring to? So that means heat. They like living in really hot environments. So you'll find these Archaea living in hot springs, like in Yellowstone. They also like to live in deep sea vents, which are also extremely hot as well. One other thing that's unusual about some of the Archaea, a lot of them have shapes very similar to the bacterial shapes, but some of them are very strange. So we have found some Archaea that have these weird shapes, like they're squares. So we don't see that in bacteria. So there are some strange shapes with the Archaea as well. Great, and then we have our last domain Eukarya. And we've got a couple of different kingdoms here. The Protists are actually not a kingdom, but just kind of a loose group which we've been pulling out and classifying into some different supergroups. But that term is still used, but we'll talk about that. But generally they're unicellular eukaryotic microorganisms that aren't plants, aren't fungi, or animals, and so they just kind of threw them together. So here's some examples of protists here. We've got a Euglena that likes to live in ponds. And then here's a Giardia. This one you can get from drinking like untreated stream water. Gets into your intestines and can give you really bad diarrhea. And then we have kingdom fungi, which we're not going to be talking about mushrooms because they're not considered microorganisms, but we do have microorganisms in the fungi kingdom. The two we'll be talking about would be yeast and mold. And then also in domain Eukarya, we do have the kingdom Plantae and kingdom Animalia, but we're not going to be talking about them because there's no microorganisms there, but they do exist. All right, let's just take a look at the protists. In domain Eukarya, generally unicellular, so they're going to have a nucleus, they're going to have organelles, they're going to be generally larger than the bacteria and Archaea if you're looking under the microscope. And just some of the groups that we find in the protists, it's a very diverse group that we find in the protists because they just kind of threw them in there because they didn't know what to do with them. So we have the algae. There's a picture on the top here of algae. The algae are photosynthetic, so they're more plant-like. And then we have protozoa. The protozoa are more animal-like because they'll ingest their food like animals do. Okay, and they can move around. They might move around like amoeba do. They use the pseudopods, the false feet. Might have flagella or cilia. Here's a paramecium covered with cilia. That's how they move around. And then we have an interesting group here, the slime molds. Here's a picture of slime mold here. This one's called dog vomit slime mold because it actually looks like a pile of dog vomit. The slime molds are interesting. They're kind of like a cross between amoeba in one part of their life cycle. They crawl around like amoeba and ingest their food, bacteria, fungi, whatever they find. So they're kind of like protozoa in one part of life cycle, but then when they reproduce, they're like fungi in that they produce spores. So they're kind of strange. Okay. We won't really be talking about slime molds, but if you take Biology 1620, you actually get to work with the slime molds in lab, which is pretty fun. So, okay, and then also in domain Eukarya, we've got kingdom fungi, and we're just going to be talking about yeast and mold here. And the fungi are very different because of how they obtain their food. So they're going to be obtaining their food by absorbing it from the environment. So what they do is they secrete their enzymes to the outside of the cell and digest their food outside the cell, and then they just absorb the nutrients. So kind of a different way to do things. They don't ingest their food like animals. They're not photosynthetic like plants. So a little bit different. Okay, and then their cell walls. They are made out of a carbohydrate, if you remember, called chitin. And the difference between yeast and mold. Yeast are unicellular, so they just have one cell. And mold are multicellular. So we've got some pictures down here on the bottom. So on the bottom left, these are some yeast cells. So you can see they're just single cells. And when they're dividing, you can see two cells stuck together, but then they'll separate. And then the mold are multicellular. So you can see in the middle, you can see all these mold cells all together. You can actually see them with just your eyeball without the microscope because there's so many cells. And this fuzzy stuff that you see with the mold with your eyeball, that's called the mycelium. Okay. And then if you look under the microscope at the mycelium, you can actually see the individual mold cells, which are called hyphae. So these long, skinny cells are called hyphae. Okay, and you can see the cell walls in between the individual cells there, and they're just kind of hooked together there. Okay, so these long, skinny individual cells are called hyphae, and then all of the hyphae grouped together to form this fuzzy mass. This fuzzy mass is called the mycelium. Okay, and then our last group of microorganisms are very interesting. They are acellular. Okay, and acellular, A means without, so they do not have a cell. Okay, so these include things like viruses. And if we look at this virus over here on the right, it's kind of cut away in the middle so you can see inside. But viruses are just composed of two things, and that's it. So they're composed of proteins and one type of nucleic acid. Oops. So they'll choose either DNA or RNA as their nucleic acid to store their genetic material, but they never ever have both inside the virus. So they'll choose one or the other. So you have DNA viruses or RNA viruses. So you can see inside this virus all this nucleic acid coiled up inside, and so it could be either DNA that's inside here or RNA, but it's never ever both. And for the virus to reproduce and make more virus, it has to get inside of a host cell. Because the virus, if it's like sneezed out and it's laying on the table, it cannot reproduce. It has to be inside of a cell, take over the cell's machinery, and it tells the cell to, hey, make more virus for me. Okay. And then we have something called satellites, which sometimes you also hear called virusoids, but I'll just use the word satellites. And these are composed of a nucleic acid, either RNA or DNA, and they need the help of a helper virus in order to reproduce. Okay, and so an example here of a satellite in humans is hepatitis D as in dog. And the helper virus for hepatitis D is hepatitis B, as in boy. Okay, so hepatitis D, as in dog, if it gets into a cell, it cannot reproduce and infect another cell unless the helper virus, hepatitis B as in boy, is also there. Okay, so we'll talk about that one later. All right, and then we have viroids, which are infectious pieces of RNA. That's strange. And so far, we've only found these causing plant diseases, so we really won't talk too much about those. And then we have prions, which are infectious proteins, which are really weird. One famous prion disease is mad cow disease. That's caused by prions.